Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkar. French President Emmanuel Macron is under fire for recent comments he made about Islam, comments that many around the world have criticized as offensive. France's own Muslim community, numbering nearly 6 million, also spoke against Macron, saying his rhetoric will only further xenophobia.
Islam is a religion that is in crisis today all over the world. We don't just see it in our country. What we have to tackle is Islamist separatism.
Following in the footsteps of past French presidents, Macron says his proposals will reinforce the country's secular identity. But critics argue those types of laws unfairly target Muslims, and that statements like tackling Islamic separatism will only stigmatize Muslims in French society while emboldening the far right. So is Macron moving France towards a more confrontational approach when it comes to Islam? And how will these laws affect ordinary people who practice their faith? And to answer that, joining me now is Yasser Louati, who is a human rights and civil liberties activist, and from Ankara, Ahmet Uysal, who is the director of ORSAM, Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, yes, sir, Macron is getting a lot of criticism for saying Islam is in crisis and all around the world and needs to be enlightened. Was he deliberately trying to be provocative?
No, he's just trying to delve into what we call Islamo diversion, create a Muslim problem to hide his failed policies. First, if Islam is in crisis, it's because it's being bombed all over the world, exploited, and that Muslim people all over the globe are facing tremendous pressure from these imperialistic policies. Now, in terms of this discourse, Emmanuel Macron did it in order to please the right-wing electorate because he knows he lost the left-leaning one. So in terms of him accusing Muslims of being separatists, he may also take care of the white supremacists who are calling for a secession between French Muslims and the rest of society, and are also already having their own training camps to violently attack them, as they tried to do it in 2019.
So, Ahmed, what do you make of Macron's speech? What does he have in mind? He said proposals would foster an Islam of the Enlightenment that is compatible with their Republican values, but he shied away from defining what it would entail. In your opinion, what would it entail?
In one side, there is, of course, this French version of secularism is that French lived this church and politics dilemma for a long time. This is harsher than other parts of the Europe. And also, we see a project of French Islam to franchising or making the Islamic teachings suitable to the French culture, which is not also possible because Islam is a universal religion, and they have kind of a superiority view on Islam and other cultures. This is more like in a way racism and ultranationalism. Mm-hmm. So they want to make their own version, and this is part of it. I mean, of course, some part of it is related to the political debate inside France, but also part of the intellectual domination or kind of a superiority perspective from the French side.
Yeah, so yes, sir, he's not the first French president to promise a new homegrown version of Islam. Successive governments had tried to do this during the 1980s, but failed to do so. So how likely it is for Macron to succeed this time by banning, for example, foreign imams entering France? Because we know that most of the perpetrators of those attacks were coming from inside. They were French nationals. What's your take on that?
Well, ma'am, first, French Islam does exist in France. The problem is that the French Republic, or at least the elite of the French Republic, don't want to acknowledge that French Muslims are equal citizens to the rest of society and that they should be managing their own affairs. We have to remember that when laicity was passed in 1905, Algeria was colonized by France. It was an integral part of the French Republic. Yet, laicity was never applied in Algeria, unlike continental France. Why? Because the colonial powers wanted to keep Islam under strict control. That's exactly what's happening today. We have a republic that wants to keep Islam under control, and anytime there is a backlash by violating laicity. They say it's impossible to reform Islam. As for the word enlightenment, this is a Eurocentric concept that somehow the Enlightenment century or the 18th century was somehow good for everybody. It may have been a liberating century for the white man, but it did not prevent slavery, colonization, and the massacres of millions of people. So right now, what Emmanuel Macron and his likes need to do is back off and let Muslims manage their own affairs as you're supposed to do under the laicity or the secular law of 1905.
France's Interior Ministry recorded 154 Islamophobic incidents in 2019. It's a 54% increase from previous years. So, Ahmet, moving forward, how could this new so-called anti-separatist proposal impact about 6 million French Muslims moving forward?
This will affect them negatively, of course, because this is more like a separationist policies, that exclusionist policies toward the Muslims, and this will not help their integration. This will cause more problem, more grievances, and more maybe excuses for the radical groups to exploit. And this will not help the French also policies of integration and homogeneity, and if they in their in parentheses upbringing the Muslim community to the par, this will not help. This will cause more estrangement, more maybe complaints about racism and other injustices. So French will not benefit from this policy, but of course this is politics, and we see the exploitation of these human rights and other issues.
So can a state force Muslims, Yasser, to exclusively attend sermons with certified imams, and how it is compatible with the freedom of speech and freedom of religion?
Well, certified by whom? The state has no right to interfere in Islamic affairs, Judaic affairs, or Catholic ones. So if they want to outsource the management of the post-colonial management of Islam and Muslims through an organization called the CFCM, the National Council of the Muslim Faith, that organization was set up by Nicolas Sarkozy, Minister of the Secular Republic. Though that means that organization is already has no credibility whatsoever. As of speaking of separatism, let's talk about the fact that Muslims are 5 times more likely of facing discrimination at work, discrimination in housing. If you are a black and Arab youngster in Paris or in France, as a matter of fact, you are 30 times more likely of being racially profiled by the police. If you are a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, statistics show that you stand a 1% chance of getting a job. So now when the Muslims try to develop solidarity networks and live amongst themselves because the rest of society excludes them, they're accused of being separatists.
But is this sustainable?
It's not sustainable, and the French government does not want to acknowledge the structural nature of Islamophobia in France. If Muslims, 3rd, 4th generation of French Muslims cannot even have equal opportunity for jobs or schooling, it's not the fault of Muslims, it's the fault of the state. And statistics show again that the #1 discriminator in France is the French state. And when you take a look at the discourse adopted by Emmanuel Macron, Gérald Darmanin, Sarkozy, François Hollande, etc., you see that they can disagree on anything, but always agree on Islamophobia.
So, Ahmet, last question. What's next for France's Muslims?
The Muslims are in very hard position, and the more the politicians provoke these anti-Islamic sentiments, also the more it feeds into them. Then they want to benefit from these policies, but it helps the radical right, anti-Islamic groups inside the country. It is not good for France. It's not good for Muslims. It's not going to be easy. I think it's becoming like more established policy that have anti-Islamic tendency in French politics. And it is, secularism normally it should be like separation of religion and no sides intervene in others. But in France, we see politics intervening in the Muslim affairs and religious affairs. This is not helping anybody.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. It's no secret that Turkey's relations with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have been fraught for years. In nearly every regional conflict or dispute, Ankara has found itself directly confronting Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. But with the UAE's push to normalize relations with Israel, is there something more substantial at play? Haider Abbasi explains.
Celebrating a rare alliance, the United Arab Emirates stunned the world in August when it announced it was normalizing relations with Israel. The last time an Arab nation recognized Israel was 26 years ago, when Jordan signed a peace treaty with the Jewish state. In September, another Arab country did the same, this time Bahrain, and there's talk of others following suit. Many have considered Iran to be the target of this new alliance. Israel and the Gulf Arab states don't hide their shared hostility towards Tehran. But there's evidence to suggest these diplomatic breakthroughs are aimed at yet another country. During last month's Arab League summit, the UAE's foreign minister said this:
Turkish interference in the internal affairs of Arab countries is a clear example of negative interference in the region.
Egypt's foreign minister said something similar.
Egypt will not stand idly by in the face of Turkish ambitions that are manifesting in northern Iraq, Syria, and Libya in particular.
The meeting was chaired by the Palestinians, who came to condemn the new agreement between Israel and the UAE. But the Arab League ignored them. Instead, it decided to establish a committee to monitor what it called Turkish aggression.
These states are usually afraid of, actually not the states, but leaders, afraid of being challenged by soft power of the other Muslim states. So that's the question. Once the foreign ministry of United Arab Emirates, declares something against Turkey, I think it's just because what Turkish image is in the minds of the Arabs in the overall Middle East.
Israel too seems to believe Turkey is a challenge. In an interview with the Times newspaper, the head of Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, said he considered Turkey to be a bigger danger than Iran. As Turkey's reach and influence grows in the region, Arab states and Israel appear increasingly threatened. Ankara backed the Arab Spring uprisings, which upset the Gulf monarchies. States like the UAE see any call for democracy as an existential threat. Turkey also has close ties with Qatar, which has been under a collective boycott by Arab states since 2017. Gulf monarchies have responded by blocking Turkish news media and discouraging tourism to Turkey. Last week, the head of Saudi Arabia's Chamber of Commerce called for Turkish products to be blacklisted.
There's a great competition in Libya that they do not want Turkey over there, and also in Syria. So once they are against Turkey in terms of military presence, they have to, create a kind of psychological environment, and an embargo for the Turkish goods is one way.
But how does being friendly with Israel hurt Turkey? Some analysts suggest the UAE wants to use Israel and its close ties with the US to undermine Turkey. With more Arab nations expected to normalize relations with Israel, can this aim be realized? Haider Abbasi, Straight Talk.
And joining me now from Istanbul is Vehbi Baysan, who is an assistant professor at Ibn Haldun University, and from Washington, D.C., Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics and geopolitical risk consulting firm. So, gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Giorgio, for decades, the Gulf Cooperation Council and Arab League's institutional failures have resulted from its members lacking a shared interests and threat perceptions. How has that changed, and why do you think is Turkey being confronted now?
Thank you very much for having me on your show. Throughout the post-2011 period, we have seen Turkey rise in the Middle East and North Africa. No doubt Turkey is an ascendant player in the region. I think it's important for us to see this within the context of a decline in U.S. influence throughout the region. There are voids and there are vacuums in the MENA region's geopolitical order and Ankara has been filling some of these voids. As you mentioned correctly, within the Gulf region, there are very different perspectives on what it means for Turkey to be a more powerful and more decisive actor. On one hand, there is Qatar and also Kuwait, and I would also add to that the Sultanate of Oman, which are Turkey-friendly countries. But we also have the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, which view Turkey as a major threat. And so this question of Turkish influence in the region is one of numerous issues that divide the Gulf monarchies.
Yes, so more than any other Arab Gulf country, Vehbi, the UAE is the most committed to confronting Turkey. Why? What's at stake for Abu Dhabi in a broader region, given its normalization of ties with Israel?
Well, it's interesting that while the UAE-Turkey relations suffer seriously, there are obviously conflict of interest in region, and that's more demonstrative in Libya. They both support, each other's enemies. Let's put it that way. But I think what's interesting here is that while the relations deteriorating, you find they're getting better relations with Israel, signing agreements, and under normalization, you can see that they're compromising the Palestinian issue, which is vital in Middle East throughout decade. But I think what is it here is very interesting. UAE in the last decade or so decided to be a major actor in the Middle East, whatever happening. So you can find them in Syria supporting the regime, or at least just turning blind eye to what's happening, or the regime brutality of the regime towards opposition. And when it comes to Egypt, well, the military coup takes place. Turkey says that this is a military coup, I mean, nothing else. And they said, no, we're fine with it. They support, the Egyptian leadership now. And in Libya, the same thing. You have the UN-supported government there. So people wouldn't kill each other and sit around the table and discuss. You find a character Haftar supported by UAE. So I think, no one can oppose if UAE wants to have an active role in the Middle Eastern issues. But I don't think they have a clear strategy on that.
Georgia, you just mentioned the declining U.S. influence in Middle East and elsewhere prompted Abu Dhabi to fill a power vacuum in the region. So can we say that the United Arab Emirates is a partner or a strategic partner to the United States? And do you think it's a reliable partner in this respect?
There's no doubt that Washington and Abu Dhabi have an extremely close partnership. This is a decades-old partnership. I think it's important to also recognize, though, that there are some serious conflicts of interest between United States and United Arab Emirates. We see this in numerous instances. As a colleague correctly pointed out, UAE supports the Syrian government. The UAE is very open about its pro-Assad stance. The Trump administration is imposing maximum pressure on the Syrian government.
Yes.
At the same time, the United States supports a unified Yemen, while Abu Dhabi is trying to split Yemen between North and South. The U.S., along with Turkey, recognizes the Government of National Accord in Tripoli to be the only legitimate government in Libya, whereas the UAE has been supporting a warlord who has been trying to overthrow that government. And also the UAE has been blockading Qatar since 2017, and the US administration is trying, with no success, but nonetheless it's trying to end the GCC crisis. So again, to answer your question, of course the US and UAE have a close partnership, but there are definitely some sources of tension between the two countries.
So, Vehbi, some have argued that the United Arab Emirates and Israel are working together to undermine Turkey in those, let's say, mentioned regions. How realistic is this, and what could they do?
Well, I think it's safe to say that yes, they're trying to undermine the efforts, but efforts of what? I mean, Turkey is saying that Palestinian issue is important and that Gaza is a world's biggest open-air prison. This should change, and we should help Palestinians. Jerusalem is important for everyone as much as Muslims and Jews. So this should be protected. When it comes to Libya, say we shouldn't allow the warlord to take over because there are a lot of serious efforts UN committed to stop civil war, stop declining situation in Libya, and same in Syria, etc. I think Turkey and UAE could have been good partners for a good future of the Middle East, but it seems it's not happening. I'm not bothered about that. I mean, two countries always can have a conflict of interest in the region. But what I'm trying to say is that the vision of UAE seems not really very clear. One thing, it seems that the regimes or any movements they're supporting is like, I think, self-adapted, quite, I think, also a dangerous acts in that view, because it's not going to take the Middle East anywhere.
Yes.
Of course, they're also dragging Saudi Arabia with them. I mean, Turkey never had bad relations in the past with Saudi Arabia. Here and there we have some conflicts, but because Turkey is not a best ally with Iran as well, so for Saudi Arabia to take a stand like this.
So, Giorgio, the Arab League ignored Palestinian call to condemn the UAE for normalizing deal with Israel. At that summit, instead, they condemned Turkey. So what's next for the Palestinians when Saudi Arabia finally normalizes relations with Israel?
I am not so sure that Saudi Arabia normalizing diplomatic relations with Israel is inevitable. I think we have to wait and see. The perspective from Riyadh on this issue is very different from the perspective in Abu Dhabi or Manama. But nonetheless, it is fair to say that Arab states are moving in the direction of normalization, and Saudi Arabia is a part of that trend. I think probably we're going to see the Palestinian leadership, especially in Gaza, become much more likely to give up for good on a number of Arab regimes and probably become more consolidated in its position that the only support it can get throughout the wider Islamic world is coming from Iran, Qatar, and Turkey, not so much Arab states that have traditionally played a leadership role in the region. One final point, if I may, it's very notable that while the Syrian government is keen to emphasize that it will not normalize relations with Israel until and unless the whole Golan Heights is returned to Syria, the regime in Damascus did not condemn the UAE-Israel deal. This is a huge contrast from 1994, when the regime of Hafez al-Assad strongly condemned Jordan for establishing diplomatic ties with Israel. That says a lot about how much Damascus values its rapprochement with Abu Dhabi.
And Vehbi, very briefly, we know that there have been some levels of talks between Ankara and Cairo, but recently Egypt's Foreign Minister Shakuri said Egypt will not stand idly by the face of Turkish ambitions, as we just mentioned, in Libya, Iraq, and especially in northern Syria. So what's the end game here?
But first of all, we should, I think, identify the Turkey's or Turkish ambitions in the region. I think it's quite ambiguous, but I know what it means, because start of the Arab Spring, you can find that the propaganda against Turkey emerged and had a strong place in the minds of Middle Eastern population, public in general. This is to say that Turkey, represented by the Erdogan, have this ambition of re-establishing Ottoman Empire in the region. So it is, I mean, they asked me in many times at the Arabic TV stations that I joined, And I mean, I said, well, guys, Turks know nothing about this. I mean, but it sells, the idea sells very well. I can see that, but it's ambiguous how that would be possible, how Turkey can reestablish Ottoman Empire, but doesn't matter. So
Okay.
I think Mr. Shukri trying to little bit refer to that issue, which always sells politically.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. I appreciate it a lot. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberkaş. If you've got any comments, follow us and tweet us at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.